The year is 1978. The Roger Williams Park Zoo is starting construction on their new state-of-the-art naturalistic polar bear enclosure. The new polar bear shall be a new zoo staple and draw many visitors in for more stuff, yeah, whatever. Yeah, we can get rid of the color filter, Yeah, there we go. Turn it off. Booyah. So, yeah, this week's episode, we're going to do something a little bit special. I can probably get rid of some of these construction pieces. We're going to be starting on the polar bear exhibit, kind of recreating it how it used to be back in, from the 1980s to basically the mid-2000s when they eventually turned it into the bald eagle enclosure. So, basically, in the last episode, I had the bald eagle enclosure and kind of made the surrounding area. So, we're going to basically take what I did last episode and kind of undo it and basically convert it into what used to be the polar bear enclosure. So, I hope everyone enjoys, and let's get started.
Alright, so starting out, the first thing I wanted to do is basically clear out the rest of the area that I did from the last episode with the bald eagles. So this backstage area is where I normally believe the polar bears were held back in the day, because I know for a fact they came out of that little door that I have on the side that's kind of cemented off and stuff. But just for now, I wanted to just clear out all the stuff I did last time, because like I said, this entire area was covered up, and this used to be the underwater viewing of the polar bear enclosure. So I basically had to dig out the entire thing and remove all the stuff. And I will say, because when we get to it later on, the underwater viewing in this entire episode had to be the hardest thing. I don't know why. It was just so hectic and annoying to deal with. Mostly because I'm working with existing terrain and paths and stuff, and so I had to basically just kind of work with what I had and just kind of manipulate it. So, what I do want to mention is a lot of the stuff, even though it's similar, if you look at reference images, I can pull up an example of what it used to be. A lot of stuff is similar to what eventually would become the bald eagle, but some of it was different. So the path back then was pushed back a little bit further, which gave the polar bears a little bit more space to kind of move around. And obviously they had the whole underwater viewing area and that sort of thing. And so basically right now I'm just kind of manipulating everything to give them more space. So kind of a little background history on the polar bear enclosure. So it was built back in the late 80s, and it was supposed to be kind of like a way to draw in more guests, because at the time the zoo wasn't nearly what it is today or even back in the 2000s. There was no elephants or giraffes or anything. It was very much just a bit of hoof stock and a couple of other smaller creatures. It wasn't in the past, going back to the 1800s, they used to have bears and that sort of thing, but nothing like a big ticket item like the polar bears were. And because of that, they would eventually become the zoo's mascot for a few decades. So basically they had primarily two polar bears at the zoo. They had a male and a female, Norton, who was the big male, and Trixie, who was the female. And Norton and Trixie were a breeding pair, so they had a few cubs throughout the years. Now, obviously, I was born in 98, so I grew up towards the later half of the polar bears at the zoo. Them only being there for maybe seven years since I was born. So my memory on this entire exhibit was a little bit fuzzy and stuff, and I had to go back through old photos and stuff to even get certain references. And the other thing is, unlike some of the other exhibits that I've had where I could just go to the zoo or look at Zoo Chat or Google Images or Street View or anything, none of that existed. No one documented the exhibits at zoos really back in the 90s and stuff, and especially no one made Street View or anything like that. And most importantly, back then believe it or not, people went to the zoo to take pictures of the animals and not the exhibits. So, I'm sure if anyone is probably, older than the age of like 25, maybe they have a better memory and would be like, oh, that's not 100% accurate, and it's definitely not going to be. So this is probably the most, I guess, makeshift episode of the, series that I've done. But again, it's a special, and I thought eventually I needed to do this. Like, the polar bears were such an important part of the zoo's history that I had to address them at some point. It was kind of like weird just being like, oh yeah, I'm doing the bald eagles, but remember literally, like, polar bears used to be our mascot, and the entire zoo's, setup is set up around the, like, polar bears. And again, just as we got rid of them because we couldn't afford it. So that's basically the situation. So, kind of back to, like, the history of the exhibits, as I mess around with the path system in the underwater viewing. That's going to be a common trend throughout this entire thing, is like messing with the three hell systems in this game, which are the path system, the terrain system, and the water system. But and the fence system. So four of them technically. All four. 4 horsemen of the apocalypse in Planet Zoo. But so basically the 3 polar bears, or I guess they had 2, then many cubs, and Norton, I'm not sure what happened to him. My mother, who is probably the best source I have as far as, what happened to the zoo, polar bears and stuff at the time, she said that Norton had killed a few of Trixie's cubs, which would have been his cubs, effectively. Except for one, which was Triton. And I do remember Triton because that was, he was maybe born in like the late 90s or whatever. And so he was with Trixie pretty much almost to the end of, her lifetime at the zoo. And so, because obviously polar bears, cubs specifically, are very close with their mothers and stuff. And so that was a big part of it. Now, again, I'm not entirely sure if that was the case with Norton. It's very possible he could have just been like, either aggressive towards Trixie or something. Polar bears are normally solitary creatures, so I can understand why something like that would have happened, but I'm not entirely sure, and don't quote me on that. But for the majority of the time that I was around at the zoo and stuff at the time, the 2 that were there were always Trixie and her son Triton, and they were basically the zoo mascots. And this was like, this was the ending of the zoo at the time. There were the like bison exhibit, but no one cared about it at the time. And so basically, you'd go through the entire zoo, which back then, would be, the standard elephants, zebras, giraffes, that sort of thing. They had an old South America building next to the seals, and they had penguins and a few other smaller animals around there, and a kangaroo exhibit. Then you'd go through the Marco Polo Trail, which we'll eventually get to, probably in the next few episodes. Finally concluding in this section, which is the North American section, which was essentially the polar bear section back then. And they even had a little walkthrough that I made in the Red Wolf episode to literally take you out just straight after you got to the polar bear, straight to the giraffe exhibit. Just because that was just, they're like, oh, you saw the polar bear, saw the elephants, you're good. You can leave. Otherwise, you could go through the wetlands trail, which, is obviously still there to this day. But that was like essentially what the zoo was in the 2000s. It was kind of like centered around the polar bear. All the advertisements had the polar bear logo on it. Even the very front like sign when you enter the zoo. If my viewers like remember the very first episode when I made the giraffe logo. Originally, that mosaic where the giraffe is now used to be a mosaic of a polar bear. And it was there well after Trixie and the polar bears were phased out of the zoo. And eventually, like I would say probably close to 6 years after they left, we eventually fixed it. I do want to comment on this. Like I said, I'm going to be messing with the actual water system for this underwater viewing a bit. There's a lot of issues I had, and it was very frustrating. So you might even see a cut eventually because I think I literally gave up on the water system until it was done for your sake because I had a lot of issues. But that was like a big, part of the zoo was these polar bears, and they were like really influential. Everyone like, not many people knew all of the names of the animals or whatever. I don't expect everyone to know, like, especially animals like the giraffes or anything. Though I know a few of their names, like Sakari and stuff. And especially stuff like the zebras and stuff. I don't expect that. But the polar bears, everyone knew Trixie. Trixie was that was our polar bear. Everyone knew her. That was the one. And so, I guess I can get to what eventually happened to the polar bears. So back in 2005, we had a master plan that was kind of set up in maybe like the early 2000s to basically reinvent the zoo and get really nice enclosures for all of our big ticket animals. So the giraffes and elephants were going to get a new state-of-the-art exhibit, which would have been twice the size, or maybe even 3 times the size of their original one. Because what a lot of people don't know is that elephant exhibit that I made wasn't always just the elephants. The third half of it, probably, like maybe across from the Red River Hogs and the lookout area by the African crown crane, used to be a bongo exhibit. Or actually, I should say not even a bongo exhibit, but more of an ungulate exhibit, because they phased a few different ungulates in and out of it, like throughout, the zoo's history. When I was a kid, there were bongos in it, but I've looked online. There's there's a hartebeest they used to have there. There was a Nyala there at one point, but it was just kind of a general African ungulate exhibit. But during this new phase, the African exhibit eventually got phased into the big elephant giraffe enclosure, and they built the Textron Elephant Giraffe Pavilion, which is like their big indoor viewing area. And one of the other parts was supposed to be a renovated polar bear enclosure. And I've talked about this a little bit in the pronghorn episode and stuff, but the entire pronghorn area was never meant for pronghorns. It was always meant to be, we were supposed to temporarily move Trixie to the Indianapolis Zoo, as well as her son Triton. And then we were supposed to do construction on a new giant North American area, with the polar bears being the focal point. And it was going to have waterfalls and all this like glaciers and a really nice area. And it was supposed to be basically, I think it was 8 times larger than this exhibit that I'm building right now. And it's because, as you can probably tell, this isn't an ideal exhibit like for polar bears. It's very archaic. It's very industrial. It's it's the traditional zoo exhibits where everything was just concrete and just kind of cement, and they would just kind of sculpt rocks to look like it was a natural environment, but at the end of the day it was just cement and water, and it wasn't a large area either, and that's obviously not good for the animals. So the new area was supposed to be a lot more organic, a lot more realistic, and obviously catered to, I think, even more than just one polar bear. It was supposed to be like several polar bears in this new enclosure. But unfortunately, the elephant exhibit went overpriced, and Trixie, unfortunately, on her transfer to the Indianapolis Zoo, died because of they say it was complications. I believe she just died due to the stress of moving itself. And that was obviously like a real heartbreaking thing for fans of the zoo, because people loved Trixie. Like, she was like a big part of the zoo. But unfortunately, she passed away. The elephants were over budget. Things just weren't looking good for the zoo from all angles. Her son was gone. We had no polar bears. The zoo was over budget, so we couldn't even afford polar bears if we wanted to. So they scrapped that idea and what would eventually become, and then just converted what was the polar bear enclosure to what is now the eagle enclosure. And I know people, like, to this day are like, oh, well, why don't they, we need bigger animals, like, why is the bald eagle taking up this enclosure? It's just the way things worked out. Bald eagles were newly introduced to the zoo at the time. They used to have an enclosure over by the beginning of the Zufari outpost across from the cheetah exhibit. They had a little makeshift enclosure, but it was just a situation where, oh, well, they're North American, we'll put them here. And eventually the golden eagles would join them in that enclosure, and that's just kind of the eagle enclosure now. And over the years, we've always had the kind of what-if scenarios with master plans that they keep kind of falling apart, because I remember shortly after they had the situation with the polar bears, they were like, but it's okay, guys, because we're going to get tigers. And this was back in 2006. And they said, we're 4 years away from tigers. 2010 comes around. It's taking a little longer. 2012, we'll have tigers. 2012 rolls around. 2016, we promise we will have tigers. It's 2020 now. The new estimate is we will have tigers by 2032. Which, I don't know why they're so, hell-bent on getting us tigers, like, if they can't keep up with the promise, but they keep promising we will get tigers on the Marco Polo Trail over where the current dromedary camel enclosure is. But our current dromedary camel, they are not going to even touch her exhibit until she dies. Her partner, unfortunately, passed away kind of recently. But until that day, they are not getting rid of it. But she's still a young dromedary, so she still has a solid 20 years left. So I guess that might be where they're coming up with the 2032 idea, but who knows. But as far as polar bears go, they still have no plans for polar bears to ever come back, which is kind of upsetting because they're a huge part of the zoo's history, and I think, it's sad to say, but they were a big part in what made the zoo good. I don't want to say good, because it's definitely not a bad zoo to this day, but a lot of the big ticket animal, back in the day, back in, say, 2005, right? The zoo had a lot more big ticket animals than they do in modern day. So back then you had elephants, giraffes, cheetahs, but then, and snow leopards, which they still have to this day. But then you had kangaroos and penguins and polar bears and, all these animals that made the zoo was a pretty decent sized zoo for New England. They had the animal catalog to really, distinguish themselves from other places. And while they still have African elephants, once those go away, if they ever do, the zoo doesn't have a lot that can be like, oh my god, Roger Williams Park Zoo really stands out in New England. Because giraffes are cool, but every zoo has giraffes. Or at least most around here. And since, they keep doing the IOU with tigers, every other zoo in New England has big cats. Be it Southwick Zoo, which has they have lions, tigers, and leopards. Franklin Park Zoo has lions and tigers. The Berkeley Zoo in Connecticut has tigers and leopards. So, the Stone Zoo has bears and leopards and stuff. But the Roger Williams Park Zoo is the only one that just doesn't have we have tigers or anything. But we did have polar bears, and that was a big thing, because especially in modern day, if your zoo has polar bears, you have a really good zoo. Because I can't even name more than 5 zoos left that have a nice polar bear enclosure. If they have polar bears at all, it's usually just like one of these like kind of cement enclosures with an old bear that's probably close to death. Like, I know even the Bronx Zoo had that situation where recently their polar bear Tundra died, and it was a very similar enclosure to this zoo. It was a cement, little plot. They had a little pool and a bear, and that was it. And the Bronx Zoo has also, stated they are not adding new polar bears either because they're just not equipped to handle them anymore. And I think that was the situation with Roger Williams. Now, Roger Williams was originally planning on, taking the initiative to make a better enclosure, but unfortunately money gets in the way, and I think the unfortunate thing is it came at a bad time for the economy as well. So you have to think of, at the time, why they couldn't afford the renovations. And it really comes down to what I think is the crash of 2008. So the post 9/11 economic environment was very bad. And so obviously zoos weren't getting as much funding and stuff as during a prosperous time. And so we had a lot of little issues like that, going through, after 2008, you had the economic depression that, kind of happened in the late aughts. And then even in modern day, I think coronavirus is going to really impact zoos across the world in their funding. So any zoos or theme parks that were probably expanding like crazy might dial back a bit now. And I think that's just the unfortunate circumstance of things like this. So, for instance, if we're going off the current master plan, the Roger Williams Park Zoo will be getting, supposedly, sea lions, grizzly bears, tigers, penguins, etc., etc., etc. All these things. But obviously you have to look at the economic situation and what was and financially is viable for the zoo. So during the time of the original 2005, 6, 7, 8 crisis, we were looking at polar bears super expensive, elephants super expensive. We can have one. So they chose the elephants. And then after they did the elephants, a lot of the actual renovations and stuff the zoo went through were very minor. They weren't animal exhibits at all. They were the Hasbro big backyard and the tree house, which was basically like a playground glorified situation, and an animal hospital and stuff like this. But none of it was new exhibits. And while we've had new exhibits in the more recent years, like Faces of the Rainforest, which is their new Tropical America building, it didn't really add anything new. It just kind of made a new shelter for existing smaller animals. And it's a nicer building, objectively, but we didn't really get new animals. Well, we got a tamandua and giant river otters, but nothing like that really wowed the public, I would say, which I think they were a bit disappointed with, because I think they expected it to be a pretty big, deal. But the fans the zoo goers just didn't really think anything of it. And I think it just comes down to the average zoo goer wants to see their big ticket animals. And so I even know some people say oh, well, we need smaller animals and stuff in the game, but this game shows off the importance of big ticket animals. Is you do need those to really attract the general public. So I actually do want to mention this that I'm doing in the time lapse right now. So as a lot of you know, Planet Zoo does not have blue water as you would kind of like for these kind of underwater viewing areas for things like polar bears or maybe penguins or something. So what I'm actually doing is I'm kind of faking it by having blue tiles at the very bottom so that when you look through the glass, it kind of like tricks you into thinking the water is more crystal clear and blue than it actually is. And that just helps a little bit, like, with the illusion. Because, unfortunately, I hope we get an aquarium expansion at some point, just because right now, water is just always murky, even if it says it's clear. And I think it works for underwater viewings for things like hippos and crocodiles, but for polar bears, it's definitely really jarring, because you could have totally clean water, and it just still doesn't really look like it's clean. It just looks like it's a little bit dirty. So right now you can kind of see me messing with the water system again. So I tried a new theory here after like the rocks and terrain wasn't working, where I basically made a giant glass tank and then just lower the actual glass when I'm done. And I end up hating the setup I did a little bit, so I kind of modify it like 4 or 5 times, and that was my fault. And it's my fault. I've learned from my mistakes. I'll definitely get better at it. But for now, you can basically just see me getting the water right, because I want to make sure that the polar bear can actually jump into it. But yeah, so let's just talk about like some of the things I've actually done in this exhibit, since I feel like I've been doing a lot of general polar bear talk, but not about this specific build. So a lot of this build was a little bit tricky to get right because I didn't have a lot of reference images to go off of. So a lot of it was memory and a couple of little things that I could find on the internet from different people. So I knew the entire thing was made out of like concrete and kind of a fake stone look. So I'm using a bunch of the tundra pieces to kind of like get that fake stone look myself. And I knew there was a waterfall in the background, and I'd love to say there was like an aerial view from like Google Earth from back then, but again, Google Earth was like barely a thing, and like the images I could find were black and white and not very clear. So I couldn't even like look into the enclosure. And of course, there's obviously the situation of foliage, which, is always an issue when it comes to zoos and from a top-down perspective. But I'm using a little bit of the water technique I used in the last exhibit, just to kind of like fake like some little water areas, because there is like a little bit of water that was not in the big tank. Right there, you can see me. I was debating adding little moss and stuff to the tops of the rocks, because technically, if you look at like some images, the rocks did have a little bit of like fake moss coloring and stuff, but I chose not to, just because I think it would have looked a little weird and random. And right now I'm just looking at reference images and trying to get all the rock shapes right and that sort of thing. You can see me here just working on the underwater viewing. No reference images I could find of this actual area, but I remember very vividly it having a rock surrounding area. I believe it's very similar to in the next episode, hint hint of what we're doing next episode, the harbor seal enclosure, which has a very similar underwater viewing area, and it's ironically right next door to this. So if you guys like pseudo aquarium builds, you'll enjoy the next few episodes. So right here, I think I was just debating it at the time if I wanted to use the tundra snow pieces, and I think around this time is when I'm like, yeah, I might as well. I'm not crazy about the texture of the tundra pieces because, again, the real zoo did not have snow. It had concrete that was painted white to look like snow. And so there was snow they would bring in during select times, like that the polar bears could cool off in, and then obviously New England winters would allow real snow to fall into the enclosure. But for the most part, the actual snow that you're seeing in the exhibit is supposed to be fake and not real. So that was another like little shame of the enclosure, is it just had a very fake vibe about it, like, and I like the concept art they had for like the proposed new polar bear enclosure, but it's just like a situation where I love hate these like kind of older exhibits. They have a lot of charm to them for like being a classical zoo. It's kind of the same thing as like those kind of like traditional red brick buildings or like classic elephant houses and that sort of thing. They have a fun aesthetic to them, but obviously functionality wise they're terrible for the animals. So what I'm doing right now is I'm actually building a small little keeper hut off to the side. Now, I couldn't find any reference images, but I do vividly remember this from when I was a child. So they had a small hut right before the the underwater viewing area of the polar bears at the top of the hill. And it was kind of just like a keeper shed, like you weren't really supposed to pay too much attention to it. But I did want to include it because I do remember it being here. It's obviously not, it could have looked nothing like this because my memory is definitely going to fail me. But I do think it was there, and it was just kind of off to the side. But again, take everything with a grain of salt because we're talking about the memory of a 7-year-old from roughly about 20 years ago at this point, like, or 15, maybe 16, 17 years ago. But yeah, so take that all with a grain of salt on everything in this entire build. It's obviously not accurate. I'm not sure if there was actually a rock wall here. I think there might have been, but it also could have been foliage for all I know. It's really hard to tell because, again, back then people just took pictures of the polar bear from the underwater viewing. They didn't take pictures of the surrounding area next to the underwater viewing. But around this time, we're kind of wrapping up this episode. I'm just kind of touching up a little bit of the surrounding area since I destroyed it at the beginning. Just adding some trees and foliage and stuff like that. And then I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. It meant a lot to me because I think the zoo, as a whole, deserves this part of history being represented somehow. So again, thank you for watching, and you can see some of the amazing cinematics. Here you go. I'm gonna have like an underwater viewing one and tons of stuff. But thanks for watching, guys, and next episode we will be finishing off this half of the zoo with the harbor seal enclosure. So I hope you guys enjoy, and stay tuned next time. Bye, guys.